Hello everyone and welcome to the House Table Pub. Now, as you all know, I am working to be a game dev and I do a lot of my game design on stream. That said, there are so many ways to create games. We have Godot, Unity, RPG Maker, Pixel Game Maker, and even the program I initially learned on, which was Yo-Yo Games' Game Maker. Now, every program I've listed has its own flaws and benefits, and some even have multiple versions that come with their own share of pros and cons. Even the list I gave is not an extensive list by any means, but they're ones that I'm aware of. Now, I'm not super familiar with most of them, and even Game Maker by Yo-Yo Games has come a long way since I first used it back in high school and college. Today, we're going to be focusing primarily on RPG Maker, and why it's a great starting point and something I think is wonderful within the game development community. Clearly, this is a topic that is near and dear to my heart. RPG Maker is a program I've spent the most time in when it comes to game design. I have a rough combined total of about 2,600 hours in RPG Maker across all of the various iterations I own, and it's not even the full amount because I did own a version of VX Ace off of Steam, so those hours aren't really tracked. Now, 2,600 hours, that's roughly 108 days worth of time, which is quite some time. I wanted to be a game developer as a child, and I remember when my high school first offered a video game after school program, I signed up immediately without question. I learned how to use Game Maker quite a bit, and my buddy and I would make these dumb little platforming games. The question is, why do I think RPG Maker is so important to the game developer space? Why is it such a great starting point? What complaints do people have about RPG Maker that make it have such a questionable reputation? I'm going to be addressing these as best I can from my own experience. I want to make it clear though, I am by no means an expert in RPG Maker. Even with all the time I've spent in it, I'm still learning and growing with a ton of things and getting more comfortable about things like coding in RPG Maker. So let's start with why RPG Maker is a great starting point. The first word that comes to mind for me is accessibility. This is the one word I think that takes RPG Maker from a good starting point and brings it to a great starting point. Cost-wise, RPG Maker MZ, the current RPG Maker on the market at the time of writing, is $80. Action Game Maker is $98, Pixel Game Maker MV is currently $85, and Game Maker by Yo-Yo Games has a professional license if you want to sell your games that costs $100. Now, I want to be clear, none of these are free if you want to make games commercially, though Yo-Yo Games is free if the games you make are just for yourself, your friends, and maybe some family. RPG Maker does come with a full suite of assets that you are able to use, including characters, character designer, tile sets, music, sound effects, enemies, and basically an entire game that you are able to just start messing with. It even comes with a few base plugins for you to adjust and get the hang of things like layout and coding, and these are things that populate every time you create a new project. Needless to say, RPG Maker itself is fairly plug and play. You turn it on and you have a bit of a sandbox. This does, however, lead into the first complaint I often hear about RPG Maker, which is that most RPG Maker games use the base assets on release. This is a fair criticism, and one that I've personally seen a few times, but I feel like people hold it a little too hard. See, when it comes to game development, there are so many hats that need to be worn, and you either are solo or you have a team. You need a programmer, an artist, an audio designer, a writer, a project manager, playtesters, debuggers, and chances are one person's not enough to do those jobs unless they're extremely efficient. There's also a high chance that if you're just getting into game development, unless you have a group of friends who want to create a game together, you may end up just needing to wear every hat yourself like I do. Mind you, there are options, including things like purchasing assets, commissioning artists, or just straight up hiring people that can do the jobs, but all of these can get expensive, and especially purchasing pre-made assets, you may not use everything you buy. Base assets are fine, but I definitely suggest adding in some of your own stuff, especially if you plan on releasing commercially. That said, I think you can do a lot with base assets. Just make sure your art style matches the look. Going back to accessibility, the UI for RPG Maker is fairly accessible. There are a few things you definitely need to check for in the manual, like the pharmacology rate, which adjusts the effectiveness of items you use, versus the recovery rate, which determines the rate you are healed by healing effects. Now, it is fairly straightforward otherwise, and just requires a bit of tinkering to find values that you're comfortable with most of the time. Your first time working with it, you may not give a skill enough power behind it, or might make an item that heals for way too much. But as you work on things, you'll find equations that you're comfortable with, or you'll find rates that work for you. With just basic assets, you'll be able to make amazing and wonderful things. Just take your time and mess around with the program. Now, real quick, I want to address another complaint I've seen a few times that just kind of doesn't make sense to me. One complaint I've seen quite a few times is that RPG Maker has a limited scope or a limited range of games that it can make. You are forced into making a JRPG style game with RPG Maker, which is kind of makes sense because it's an RPG Maker. It's a basic program, makes 2D things, so you should be walking into it expecting to make games like Final Fantasy VI in appearance and mechanics, or Golden Sun in mechanic alone. But anyone who looks at RPG Maker and expects something more is not looking at the program for what it's meant to be. This is like buying a toaster and trying to get it to make soup. Sure, you can do it for that kind of thing, but there's really better options. There are options to make RPG Maker allowed to create tactical RPGs like those of Final Fantasy Tactics or Fire Emblem or Disgaea, action RPGs like Legend of Zelda, and from what I've been told, there's even a plugin for RPG Maker MV specifically that allows you to code platforming games. At the end of the day, though, RPG Maker is for making RPGs. It's what it's meant to do. Now, there are ways to make other things work, as I said, and in time you can even learn to do those things yourself. I think it's very important before buying RPG Maker, get an idea of what kind of game you want to create, and then looking into if that can be done in RPG Maker with the skill set you have. Do the research to make sure you're buying the product you need, and then, at least if you're disappointed, it was a failure of available information and not just a misconception. Now, I'm going to stress something that's a little bit hard of a pill to swallow. In all pursuits of art, there's a saying: trust the process. Making a game is no different. There'll be times where your code might look ugly or disorganized. There'll be times where you're not even sure your code is going to work until you test it. There'll be times where you're putting together a map and it just doesn't look that great yet. But the key word is yet. While RPG Maker is fairly plug and play, it's time consuming. For Project Dungeon Core, the game I'm currently working on, I've spent maybe 20 to 30 hours just encoding the database to get it where I want, and I'm still not done. That's not even factoring in things like doing art, planning external documents, of course, talking to anyone who will listen to me so that I can figure out solutions, come up with new ideas, or just get people interested in my game. RPG Maker MZ is not the kind of program that you can buy and get a good feel of within Steam's little refund window of, I believe it's 2 or 3 hours. You need to trust the process, and what you want will come in time, as long as you work at it. Do I need a coding background for RPG Maker? I'm going to give this a soft no. I'm a little bit biased here. I did go to college for web-based game design, which turned into a glorified web design class. And, you know, even in high school, there was a small amount of coding. Having a coding background will help, and that's why I say a soft no. Because it will help, but it won't. Not having one won't stop you. Being able to code gives you a ton more control over the appearance of your game's menus, options, and skills, and honestly, a lot of the mechanics in general. There'll be times where you may want to use conditional branches, and the logic breakdown might seem a little bit weird if you're not familiar with nuances of coding and the logic work that goes into it. But a big piece of it all is just learning how the operations work and finding a good way to run them. UI takes away the need for a large portion of coding, but I would suggest learning how to get some things to operate even without using the UI. Being able to call game data manually could be useful when writing plugins that you might want to code, or if you decide to bring your game dev to a new level and use a different program. Now, to help in this, in the description I'll put a link to it. As you can see, someone sat down and wrote a document that shows a ton of useful script calls that can end up being really helpful. I even used one in my own game. The program of RPG Maker itself is extremely accessible for those who aren't really coding, oriented, or maybe don't have any coding ability at all. Now, plugins from certain creators some of them will be plug and play, and some will require a lot of work. Again, I suggest doing some digging, but sometimes you'll find creators who, as long as you seem to put the effort forth, they'll get it done with you, and they won't have a problem. So where is the barrier of entry for RPG Maker from a cost standpoint? Well, if you go to the RPG Maker website, there are free trials of several versions of RPG Maker, and even their other thing of Visual Maker, or Visual Novel Maker. RPG Maker often has bundles that are available on pages like Humble Bundle, and even Steam will randomly drop sales on them. Otherwise, the program, as I said before, is $80 for the newest version, and any additional purchases are unnecessary and up to the scope of your project. This is all stuff you can plan out in advance, as I show in my first Descent into Development video about game design documents, which I suggest giving a quick watch after this video if you're interested in game development. Now, why is RPG Maker so important to the game development space? I'm going to use Godot as a bit of a comparison here, and you'll see why. See, Godot is a game development engine that is free to use. Knowing this, why not just go use Godot? It's free. Well, Godot is not plug and play. If you want to make Godot work, you need to learn the coding, get the assets, or make the assets yourself. Very eventually becomes a matter of skill and or financial, as opposed to just being able to pick up the game and sit down and mess around. That's not to say that Godot is a problem. In fact, I think Godot is a genuine boon for the game development community, and a friend of mine is even creating a game in Godot that I can't wait to share with everybody. Where RPG Maker has a loose entry barrier of $80, Godot has an entry barrier of beginning completely from scratch with everything. I think RPG Maker represents the ability to step into game development with little to no knowledge and grow and excel that knowledge until it's become beyond the scope, and then maybe you swap over to something like Godot where you trade the solid foot base that you had for something that gives you full control over what you're doing. There is one final complaint I am going to talk about in this video, and it is the complaint that infuriates me. To literally no end, this complaint irks me. In the base RPG Maker, there is no base coding for RPG elements like quest keeping, minimaps, or inventory management. This complaint drives me up a wall. And it does so for a simple reason. It is opposite. The first reason, honestly, is it's so opposite the assets issue. Because so many people complain about the lack of creativity with using the base assets and the base character generator. And some of those same people get so mad because, oh, well, if I want to code in a thief skill of steal, I have to either get the code from somebody else or I have to sit down and learn it. And I bring up that because there is no code for stealing items. There are countless plugins that let you do exactly that, but you don't even need those. You can code stealing in using simply common events, switches, and the events on the enemy page. How do I know this? Well, I figured out how to code stealing using RPG Maker VX Ace probably about 8 years ago. It was one of the first things I sat down and learned and figured out, and I was very proud of myself when I did. I ported it over multiple times into every project until I decided, you know what, I have the plugin that came with this $100 bundle I spent money on. I'm just going to use that now. It's a little bit cleaner, it works a little bit better, you know, but the original code isn't terrible, it's just not perfect. Even the code I'm using now is not perfect. And I think it's very important to know that. The reason that these things don't exist in RPG Maker, though, is also important. And that's so that you can learn. The effort you need to put in to learn how to put these things in can go a long way into teaching you. For example, the thief coding. The way I did that was that when you use the skill, it would immediately proc a check on if the stealing skill has been attempted. And at the end of every battle, it would turn off this skill. When you use the ability, what happens then is it reaches over and it rolls a die. I think I used a D10 at first, and then I just varied it based off of how much loot the enemies might have had. And based off of the result of that random number, it would basically say, all right, if roll this, then take this. If roll this, then take this. And at each point it would say, you know, break event, break event, break event. And there was no actual script written. I didn't code, I didn't write a single line of code. I just used the UI that was available. And it was long and tedious, but it worked. That's what matters. If RPG Maker had a steal code programmed into it, I wouldn't have taken the time to do that. And I would never have learned it, and I wouldn't be better for it. I've seen a lot of people compare RPG Maker games to Mario Maker games, or Mario Maker levels, and I think that that's a really gross misrepresentation. Yes, there are people who just take the cookie cutter base game and write their own stories, but there are also people who take RPG Maker and write these super complex, in-depth games that are, you know, just as expansive as some AAA titles, if not more. So that's why I think RPG Maker is a great starting point and a great thing within the game development space. It's a starting point. It gives you a base to jump from and get creative so that you can get things where they need to go. All of the assets it gives you are great, but if you don't use them properly, they mean nothing. If you take the sound effect of dripping water from a cave and you put it in what's supposed to be a lively tavern, it just feels wrong. If you take a lively, upbeat song full of cheer and such, and you put it at a moment where an NPC who's important to the plot is, you know, dying, you're undercutting that scene. It takes finesse, and sure, that stuff like that is nice and obvious, but the moments to use silence are just as important, and those require a lot of effort and a lot of learning. Choosing the right assets is something you can learn because RPG Maker gives you the base assets, and you can add or remove or adjust all of them without any issue. But I think that's everything I had to say. Do you use RPG Maker? Are you looking to get into game development? Let me know down in the comments below. If you enjoyed the video, maybe drop a like, and if you're new here, why not subscribe to keep coming to the House Sable Pub? We're live all but Monday and Wednesday. I drop videos every other Wednesday, and we have a Discord down in the description below where you can drop in, say hi, and maybe even talk about game development stuff yourself. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.